Nobody in Deller Junction was supposed to be living in those rail cars. The 8 old cars on the abandoned spur had been rotting there for 15 years. The town had stopped looking at them a long time ago. That was its own kind of decision. But one of them had smoke coming out of it. Steve McQueen saw it before he had fully taken in the town. He had pulled off Route 33 for gas, stepped out into the flat January cold, and there it was, rising from the second car from the end of the spur, where the tracks curved behind the platform into shadow. A thread of pale gray smoke, no wider than a finger, from a pipe the size of a man's fist pressed through a gap near the top of the car's side wall. Not the smoke of a fire, the smoke of someone trying not to make smoke. Careful, controlled, someone alive in there, doing their best not to be seen by a town that had decided not to see them. Steve paid for the gas. The attendant, a teenager with oil on his chin, said nothing when Steve's eyes went across the street to the spur, took the money, and went back inside. That, too, was an answer. Steve parked in the depot's gravel lot. Through the ticket window, an old woman at a counter, back to the glass, not moving. The main street had the feel of a place performing ordinary life, without quite believing it, men standing too still near the hardware store, a curtain going deliberately still in the window above the barber shop. He got out and walked toward the spur. The weeds snapped under his boots. He kept his hands in his jacket pockets, pace easy. A man taking a walk. The cars up close were worse than they looked from the road. Broken windows, warped doors hanging open. One with a section of roof gone, frost on the inner walls catching the flat winter light, the kind of clean that only means empty and frozen and forgotten. The second car from the end was different. Its windows were boarded from the inside, he could tell because the nailheads faced outward. The sliding door was secured with a length of rope knotted through the iron handle and tied back to a wall bracket. Not a lock, but a statement. This door does not open without intention. Steve stopped and listened. From inside the car, barely audible through the wood, a child's voice, not crying, talking quietly. In the private way children talk to themselves when they believe they are alone. The murmur of a small person speaking to something small they are holding. The sound of it, coming out of that frozen hulk of iron and rotted wood, was so ordinary and so completely wrong that it stopped him where he stood. He looked back at the main street. Nobody visible. The curtain above the hardware store had not moved again, but the stillness of it now felt like attention. He turned back and knocked on the door. 3 times. Unhurried, the child's voice stopped. The silence that followed had shape and weight. It was the silence of people who have learned to go completely still at unexpected sounds. He could feel the quality of it through the wood. He waited. Then careful sound of something being moved inside. Then nothing. He knocked once more. Same rhythm. A woman's voice came through the door, controlled, pressed flat against the fear underneath. "We're not open." 3 words that had no business in that context. The last scrap of ordinary language a person could wrap around a situation that had long since left ordinary behind. "I'm not looking for anything," Steve said. "Just checking." A pause. The thinking kind. "Everything is fine," the voice said. The smoke kept rising. The cold kept pressing in. He did not turn around. He sat down on the iron step beside the door, settled his jacket, and waited. 7 minutes. He counted them on the depot clock visible through the spur weeds. Its hands moved with the absolute indifference of a mechanism that had no opinion about anything happening underneath it. During those 7 minutes, Steve did not move, did not speak, did not knock again. He sat on the cold iron step, with the frost working at the edges of his collar, and made himself into something that did not require a response. At 7 minutes, the rope inside the door was unknotted. The door slid open 3 inches and stopped. A pair of dark eyes in the gap. A boy, about 8. Thin face. Serious in a way that was not shyness serious, the way a child gets serious when experience has replaced innocence with something harder and more functional. He wore a red knit hat, pushed low over his ears, and a coat too large across the shoulders, a coat inherited from someone larger who was no longer there to wear it. He looked at Steve without expression and without moving back. Steve looked back at him the same way, level, no performance of friendliness, which children read through instantly. "Cold out here," Steve said. The boy considered this with the weight it deserved. "Cold in here too," he said. The door stayed at 3 inches, did not close. A hand appeared on the boy's shoulder from behind, firm, not rough, and moved him gently aside. A woman's face filled the gap. Brown hair pulled back so tight, the skin at her temples looked strained. Eyes that had once been open and were now organized around a core of wariness, so deep it had become load-bearing, the way scar tissue holds a wound closed. She was younger than the situation made her appear. 28 or 29. She had not slept enough, eaten enough, or been warm enough in longer than she would say. She studied him the way people who have been hurt by trustworthy-looking people learn to study strangers, not looking for warmth, but for the small, mechanical tells of calculation that warmth is sometimes used to disguise. The door moved another 4 inches. "I don't know you," she said. "No," Steve said. "You don't." Through the gap now, he could see inside. Army blankets on every wall, layered 3 deep in places, pinned with bent nails. The blankets had been hung not for comfort, but for insulation to trap the little heat the small iron camp stove was producing. The stove sat on a piece of quarry stone placed over the wood floor to protect it, and it held a fire that was working hard but losing the argument with January. The air coming through every warped seam in the car's old frame was winning. On a board laid across 2 brackets, a shelf stood a row of tin cans, their labels written over in grease pencil in her handwriting. A lantern with a punch-tin screen where the glass had been cast weak, patterned light across the blanket walls. The boy's breath was faintly visible, even with the stove going. At the woman's feet, exactly at her feet, left foot touching it, though she was not standing over it deliberately, was a brown leather case, worn pale at every corner. Creased the way an object gets when it is carried rather than stored. Its clasp lock was bright brass, newer than everything else in that car by a considerable distance. The kind of lock a person adds to something when what is inside it becomes worth more than the thing itself. It was the only object in the railcar that was not beaten down by use. "My name is Steve," he said. She did not offer hers. "There's a diner up the street," he said. "If the boy wants something hot." In the gap beside her shoulder, the boy's face reappeared. Something crossed it that children try hard to suppress when they have learned that hope generates disappointment, that small, involuntary flutter, there for less than a second before the guard came up again. He kept his right hand in his coat pocket. Steve could see the fist shape through the fabric, something hard inside it, a fist around something he held, even in sleep. "We don't need charity," the woman said. "I know you don't," Steve said. "I offered something hot. January. That's all it is." The silence after that changed its character. He felt it. "Who are you?" she said. "Passing through. Stopped for gas." "People who stop for gas don't come back here." "No," he said. "They usually don't." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her son, who was watching her with eyes that asked nothing and refused nothing. She stepped back from the door. "5 minutes," she said. He stood and moved toward the platform to give her space. While he waited, he looked at the town. The bank's windows too clean for the street they were on. The depot window where the old woman had not moved. The specific purposefulness of the people on the street, the way people move when they don't want to be stopped and asked about anything. Mavis came out of the railcar with Toby beside her. The leather case was in her left hand. She had not considered leaving it behind. Steve noticed. He said nothing. They walked up toward the diner, 3 of them, in the January cold. Above the hardware store, the curtain moved again. This time, whoever was holding it did not try to put it back. Ainsley's diner was warm in the way of a kitchen that has been working since before dawn. It hit Toby at the threshold. He stopped walking mid-step, his eyes closed. Not in a childlike, dramatic way, in the way of someone whose body has been managing cold for so long that warmth has to be processed before the legs can continue. A full second. Maybe 2. His mouth opened slightly, as if the heat of the room had entered through it. Nobody said anything. Steve looked at the menu board. Mavis looked at the counter. They both understood what they had just seen. Ruth Ainsley was behind the counter. Compact woman, gray threading through dark hair, the economical movements of someone who has run a kitchen alone for a decade and wasted no motion in it. When she looked up and saw Mavis Rowan walking in behind a stranger, something crossed her face that she replaced in under a second with the professional neutrality of a woman who serves everyone and remarks on nothing. She had left food on the railcar step twice a week since October. Mavis had never said a word about it to her. Neither had Ruth. Between them existed a particular understanding that required neither. Steve took the corner table, back to the wall, facing the door. not a choice he thought about. A habit so old it had become architecture. Mavis sat across from him, Toby beside her. She placed the leather case on the bench seat between Toby and the wall and kept her left knee against it. Ruth brought coffee without being asked. She set a glass of milk in front of Toby and looked at the table when she did it, not at the boy, because looking at the boy would have required looking at what had been done to him, and she was not ready to do that in front of witnesses. Toby picked up the glass in both hands and drank from it in small, deliberate sips, the sips of a child who has been managing scarcity long enough that he cannot stop managing even when the scarcity is paused. He kept his other hand in his coat pocket. The fist around the locomotive did not loosen. "How long at the depot?" Steve asked. Mavis wrapped both hands around the mug. The warmth traveled visibly up her wrists, into her forearms. "Since September." He didn't do the arithmetic out loud. 4 months in a California winter. He moved on. "Your husband?" "He died in November." The pause was surgical. She had learned to create space around those words, so they did not bleed into everything adjacent to them. The county called it an accident. Was it? Nobody in Dellard had asked her that in 2 months. The directness of it, no softening, no hedge, just the question shifted something in her face. "No," she said. Toby had gone completely still beside her, the shape of his fist visible through the pocket. Before Mavis could say another word, the front door of the diner opened. The man who came in was not large. He was trim, 50 or so, in a good wool overcoat with a hat that had a dark band, and a mustache maintained at exactly the width that suggested precision rather than vanity. His shoes were polished to a depth that announced money without any of the vulgarity of displaying it. He moved through the room with the settled ease of a man who had not been asked to stop anywhere in a very long time and had consequently forgotten that stopping was possible. He looked at Mavis first, not at the stranger, not at the boy. "Mavis, Mrs. Rowan." His voice was warm the way a rehearsed thing can be warm, technically accurate at room temperature, produced by discipline rather than heat. "Didn't know you were coming in today." Mavis had known he was there before he spoke. Steve had watched her shoulders make a small, involuntary adjustment the instant the door opened, the bracing of someone who knows exactly what kind of cold is about to enter. "Mr. Haskell," she said to her coffee cup. Vern Haskell walked to the table with the ease of a man who has never had reason to approach a table any other way. He stood at the end of it, hands clasped loosely in front of him, and let his eyes move across the room. Mavis, Toby, Steve, the leather case on the bench seat. He did not look at the case. He looked at everything else with measured interest, and excluded the case with a precision that was itself a form of looking. "Just came by to say hello," Haskell said. "Make sure things are manageable." The smile appeared and dissolved. "I did want to mention, and I know this has come up before, the rail company has been making inquiries about the back spur. Inspection in February. I'd hate for you and the boy to find yourselves without options." Every word had been selected. The sentence sounded like concern expressed by a decent man. It was a wall, built in plain sight, one reasonable-sounding word at a time. There was no word in it that could be pointed at directly. That was the point. "I understand," Mavis said. "I knew you would." His eyes moved to Steve with the minimal curiosity of a man cataloging an unknown variable. "Passing through?" "That's right," Steve said. Haskell held his gaze for exactly as long as a man holds a gaze when he is determining whether the other person has registered something that was never technically stated. Then, "Roads are good heading south, this time of year." He tipped his hat fractionally to Mavis. He did not look at Toby. Not an oversight. A man like Haskell did not have oversights. He turned and walked out, and the door settled behind him with a sound like a sentence being ended. The diner returned to its surface sounds. A pot somewhere. Wind against glass. Through Toby's coat pocket, the fist had gone white at the knuckles. Ruth came out with the soup. She set it down without words, went back behind the counter, and picked up a dishcloth she did not need, and began cleaning a surface that did not need cleaning, keeping her eyes very carefully away from the window through which she could see Vern Haskell crossing toward the bank. Steve had recognized what Haskell was the moment the man walked in. The man who never raises his voice because he has arranged things so raising it is never necessary. He also noted that the man at the counter who had been there when they arrived, the one with the newspaper, had still not turned a single page in the last 14 minutes. Steve picked up his spoon. "Tell me about your husband's job," he said. Mavis watched the steam from her soup, not eating, deciding how much she could give to a man she had known for 40 minutes. The railcar had not saved her. The case had survived. She had not found a way to make it matter. She looked at him and began. Cliff was the freight yard supervisor, she said. 2 years at this position. 6 years in the Fresno yards before that. He understood freight the way some men understand engines, not just the operation but the logic underneath it. Every form, every route, every sequence, and why each one existed. She turned the cup. He was precise. He noticed when things didn't line up. That quality did not make him popular with people who needed things to appear to line up. What didn't line up? About 2 weeks before he died, he started coming home changed. Not frightened. Cliff was not that. But careful. The way a man is careful when he has found something loose in a structure and is still determining how much of the structure depends on it. What had he found? Weight records. Certain cargo moving through Delaware Junction was being recorded with different weights on the outgoing manifest than on the incoming receipt. He thought at first it was clerical error. She turned the cup again, the same slow motion, a habit of the hands when the mind is working hard. It was not error. He went back 9 months. The same discrepancy, the same direction, the same class of freight car, 37 times. Something was being removed from those cars between arrival and remanifesting, coming in heavy, going out light. The missing weight belonged to someone who needed it to not exist on paper. Steve set his spoon on the table. 9 months, 37 instances. Same pattern, same direction. Not sloppiness. A system. Built and running long enough that the people running it had stopped expecting interruption. Haskell approved the manifests. Haskell controlled every freight contract for this section of the line. He had Sacramento, 6 years of relationships at the regional office, the kind of access that means nobody looks closely at a small junction because a well-liked man has already told them there is nothing to look at. She glanced toward Toby, who was eating his soup with focused attention and hearing every word. Cliff made copies. He did not take originals he knew that would tell Haskell immediately what had been found. He hand-copied the relevant forms and wrote his own analysis. He put it all in the case. He was taking it to the Federal Freight Audit Office in San Francisco, not Sacramento. Specifically, not Sacramento. He didn't trust that Sacramento was clean. She stopped. He was going 2 days after he died. Steve looked at the leather case between Toby and the wall. A ream of paper. What it held, if Cliff Rowan had been as methodical as his wife described, was the kind of inside documentation that federal investigators spent years trying to reconstruct. And it had been sitting in an abandoned railcar since November, in the custody of a widow with no representation, no money, and nowhere else to go. He looked toward the window. Haskell and the unrecognized man had moved. They were no longer in front of the bank. They were closer across the street now, at the edge of the hardware store awning, their backs still carefully angled away from the diner, but much closer than before. The debt appeared 2 days after the funeral, Mavis continued. An outstanding account attributed to our family against the freight company. No such debt existed. The paperwork was there regardless, properly filed, witnessed, stamped. Donald Price told me contesting it would cost more than I had. She looked at her hands. The sheriff said it was a civil matter. He looked at the floor when he said it. She paused. Someone has tried to get into the railcar twice. I could tell from the door. Toby told me a man looked through the window gap one afternoon while I was at the pump. After that, the case does not leave my person. She reached inside her collar and drew out a thin chain, a small brass key. She held it where he could see it for one deliberate moment, then let it fall back. Every hour, she said, every day. Steve looked from the key to the man at the counter who had not turned a newspaper page in 15 minutes, then at the window. Haskell and the man he had been standing with outside the bank were no longer there. He didn't know where they had gone. He didn't like not knowing. "Stay here," he said. "Don't go back to the railcar today." He put on his jacket and left money on the table. "You don't have to do anything," Mavis said, not asking him to stop. Warning him about what doing anything in Delaware Junction would cost a man who had stopped for gas and was technically free to leave. He looked at her. "I know," he said. Behind him, as he walked toward the door, Toby watched him go with the patient. Level attention of a boy who has spent months learning to judge which adults mean what they say and which ones he should not watch walk away. He did not go toward the bank. He crossed to the depot. The waiting room was cold, with the specific cold of institutional rooms that have heating systems they have mostly abandoned. 4 wooden benches around a dead radiator, a notice board with summer papers curling at the corners, the stillness of a public space that no longer feels particularly public. Behind the ticket window, the woman from the glass, late 60s, white hair under a green felt hat she wore indoors and out. Her hands on the counter had a tremor she no longer tried to suppress. Her eyes, when she looked up, were the eyes of someone who had not slept well in months. Help you? Professionally neutral, with something beneath it, working hard. That was not neutral at all. I am Kay, trying to figure out the freight schedule, Steve said. Anything moving through in the next week. She opened the binder from the motion of 30 years. 1 eastbound freight, Thursday morning. That's about all anymore. Busier in November? The hands shifted on the counter. A little. Why do you ask? Heard there was an accident here. Man from the freight operation. Nettie Vale's hands stopped moving. He had been watching for that, not for what she said, but for the moment before it, when the body responds ahead of the managed version. November 18th, she said. Her voice had moved to a different register. Something underneath it was working. Terrible thing. You were on duty that night. I work evenings Tuesdays and Fridays. November 18th was a Friday. So you were here. I was here. The echo quality of a line, said before. He let the pause fill. Did you see Mr. Rowan come through before it happened? The tremor in her hands became visible enough that she placed one over the other to hold it. The gesture of someone who has been managing this for months and whose management is becoming unreliable. The sheriff asked me that, she said. And the phrasing was precise. Not I, answered the sheriff. But the sheriff asked me that as if the asking and the answering were 2 events she was choosing to reference only one of. What did you tell him? I told him what I saw. Mr. Rowan came through the depot on his way to the yard. He sometimes worked late. The words had the smoothed quality of a sentence said so many times that the original texture of what actually happened had been worn away beneath the repeating. Was he alone? The pause this time was longer. The kind of pause that has a decision inside it, the pause of someone who has been choosing between 2 things for a long time and is still choosing. There were other people using the depot that evening, she said. It's a public space. Not yes, not no. Steve looked at her for a moment. She held it. He looked down at the binder as if satisfied. That's all I needed. Thank you. He turned toward the door. Who are you? Nettie Vale said. She had not meant to say it. He could tell from the way it came out, slightly ahead of whatever was intended to hold it, the way things escape when the person holding them has run too low on reserves to maintain the grip. He turned. Steve McQueen, he said. He watched the name land. She knew it. Recognition moved through her face, not as excitement, but as vertigo. The name came from a world she had not expected to enter this ticket window today, and it was attached now to the man who had just asked her, very quietly, whether Cliff Rowan had been alone. The actor, she said. Barely a question. That's right. Something behind her eyes began moving and found nowhere to go. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful, she said. Steve held her gaze long enough for it to mean something beyond politeness. I think you could be, he said, if you decided to. He went out. The bell rang above the door. On the depot platform, he stopped and looked down the spur. The smoke was still there, faint against the white January sky, rising from the second car from the end. Pale, persistent, impossible to unknow. He stood there in full view of the bank and the hardware store. He was aware, without looking directly, that a man had come out of the barber shop across the street and was not going anywhere in particular, just standing, hands in his coat, facing a direction that allowed him to see the platform without appearing to watch it. Steve had been watched by better people than whoever this was. He stood long enough for Dellard Junction to understand that the man who had stopped for gas was still here and had something specific in mind. Then he went back to the diner. Toby was asleep when Steve came back through the diner door. The boy had gone under in the way children go under when exhaustion finally catches them in a warm enough room fast, total, without negotiation. He had leaned against the diner wall with his coat still buttoned and the red locomotive in one hand and simply stopped. His face in sleep had released everything the waking version of it was maintaining. What was left was a boy's face. Just that. The face he would have worn every ordinary day in a life that had gone differently. Mavis was watching him and had not touched her coffee. Steve sat across from her, said nothing, waited. After a while, without looking away from Toby, he used to talk constantly. About trains. Mostly. Cliff used to bring him to the yard on Saturdays and explain every car, every load, every system. Toby could name a car class by the sound of its wheels on the track. She stopped. He hasn't spoken about trains since November. He won't walk near the yard. A pause. He stopped talking the day they told me about Cliff. He hasn't fully started again. Steve waited. She looked at her coffee, made a decision. Cliff found the discrepancy in October. He mentioned it to me as small weight records not matching between incoming receipt and outgoing manifest on certain freight. He thought it was clerical error at first. Sloppy work in an understaffed yard. She turned the cup slowly. It wasn't error. The same discrepancy appeared 37 times over 9 months. Always the same class of car, always the same direction. Something was being removed at Dellard Junction between the time freight arrived and the time it was remanifested. The weight of it was vanishing. Someone with the authority to sign both sides of that paperwork was the one making it vanish. Haskell. Haskell approved everything on this section of the line, had the Sacramento contacts, had 6 years of goodwill at the regional office, which meant nobody in Sacramento was looking at Dellard closely. Steve looked toward the counter. The man with the newspaper had gone. The stool was empty. Ruth was visible in the kitchen doorway, her back to the room, but not moving. Listening. Cliff didn't confront him, Mavis said. He was smarter than that. He copied the relevant records, didn't take the originals, which would have announced immediately that something was missing, and wrote his own analysis of the pattern. He put it in the case. He was going to San Francisco 2 days after he died. Not Sacramento. Federal level. Because he didn't trust that Sacramento was clean. She touched the case beside Toby without looking at it. He locked it the night before he went to the yard for the last time. Gave me the key on its chain. Told me to keep it on my body and not open it until I had someone who could understand what was inside and help me take it somewhere it couldn't be made to disappear. Steve looked at the case, then at the empty stool, then at Mavis. Someone has already tried to get into the Railcar, he said. It wasn't a question. Twice, she said. Haskell knows Cliff made copies. He would have searched the records after November. He knows the evidence exists. He just can't find it. Because you've had it on your person every hour of every day. Yes. Steve checked his watch. Just past 1. Through the diner window, the barber shop across the street. The man who had been watching the platform from outside it had gone back inside. That meant someone had already reported to someone that Steve McQueen was still in Dellard and had visited the depot. Haskell would know about Cal Deming. He would know Cal had known Cliff. He would put those two things together quickly. How long before Haskell moves more directly, Steve said. The February inspection gives him a reason to have us removed officially, she said. After that, he doesn't need to break in. He just waits while we're forced onto the street with nothing. I need to find Cal Deming, he said. He was already putting on his jacket. Don't go back to the Railcar. And don't let that case leave the bench seat. I'm masses. He was at the door before she spoke. You don't have to do this, she said. He looked back at her, at the woman who had been carrying an impossible weight alone for 4 months, in the cold, for a boy who had stopped talking, and a husband whose death had been filed and closed and forgotten. I know, he said, and walked out. Cal Deming's was the blue house on the corner of Marsh and 4th, porch light burning in the middle of the day. Steve had gotten the address in 60 seconds from the gas station boy and drove the 2 blocks without hurrying. Cal answered the door in a plaid shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. When he saw Steve McQueen standing on his porch in January, he had the look of a man who had been expecting something to arrive at his door for months and had spent that time refusing to prepare for it. I know who you are, Cal said. He had looked up the street in one direction, then the other, before saying it. An old habit. I want to talk about Cliff Rowan, Steve said. Cal stepped back from the door. Inside, the smell of coffee and machine oil and 3 decades of working life, rail handbooks on 2 shelves. A framed photograph on the living room wall, a freight train on a mountain grade, Cal, somewhere in the crew. In the kitchen, a second photograph, a young, dark-haired woman, holding a small girl. The daughter, the granddaughter, the reasons. They sat at the kitchen table. Cal poured without asking. You know what Cliff found, Steve said. I suspected, Cal said. Careful word. I'm retired. don't have access or authority. But I've been reading freight manifests for 30 years, and the Deller Junction numbers haven't looked right to me for longer than Cliff was looking. He turned his cup. I told myself I didn't have enough. I told myself it wasn't my business. And after Cliff died? Outside, a car moved slowly down the street. Neither of them looked at it. After Cliff died, Cal said, I knew what I knew and I didn't say it. My daughter lives 20 minutes from here. Her husband works the freight platform at the next junction. Vern Haskell knows both their names and the name of their daughter. He stopped. That's my explanation. It is not my excuse. He said it the way a man says a thing he has been holding for a long time in a place that has cost him to hold it. Steve looked at the photograph of the young woman with the small girl. He let the room be quiet for a moment. There is an 8-year-old boy sleeping in a frozen railcar, he said. His father was killed because Haskell needed a problem to stop. His mother has been carrying federal evidence against Haskell for 4 months in that car, without a single person in this town standing beside her. She has a key around her neck and a locked case she hasn't opened because she was afraid she'd get it wrong. She hasn't gotten it wrong. The case is still there. Cal looked at the table. I'm not asking for bravery, Steve said. I'm asking you to say, in a room, what you already know. That's the whole ask. And the porch light was visible through the window, burning in the daytime. Cal had turned it on the morning after Cliff Rowan died. He had not turned it off since. Whether he knew why, Steve could not say. Cal Deming looked at the photograph of his daughter for a long time. Then he set down his cup and stood up. 10 minutes, he said. When Steve and Cal walked into Ainsley's diner together, the afternoon had shifted. Ruth Ainsley was in the kitchen doorway watching the street with the expression of a woman who had been holding a breath since September and was beginning to permit herself the possibility of air. The man with the newspaper was gone. The stool was empty. The coffee ring remained on the counter. Ruth had not wiped it, which said everything. Mavis looked up when they came in. When she saw Cal Deming behind Steve, she went still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. She knew Cal, known him as someone who had neither participated in what was done to her nor stopped it. The distinction between those two things existed in the room between them, and it was real, and it had never been spoken, and now here he was, and his coming here, on this day, meant something. Mrs. Rowan, Cal said. He said her name with the weight a man uses when he owes something and is beginning to pay. Toby had woken while they were out. He was sitting up straight, coat buttoned, studying Cal Deming with the focused attention he gave to men who had something to do with trains. I know you, Toby said. You worked the freight yard. Cal looked at the boy, and for one moment his composure went somewhere private. That's right, he said. Your father and I talked most mornings. Toby looked at him for a moment. Then he put his hand back in his pocket. Not hostile. Processing. Steve sat down and looked at Mavis. It's time, he said. Mavis set the case on the table. Not with ceremony. With the absolute care of someone placing down something that has been against their body for 4 months. Something that has been the only thing between her family and the complete erasure of what her husband did and why he died. She set it down the way you set down, a thing you are trusting the world to receive correctly for the first time. She drew the chain from inside her coat. The brass key turned in the lock with a small, clean sound, the sound of a mechanism that had been installed precisely and had been waiting for this moment with the patience of a built thing. She opened the case. Carbon copies, original forms with freight company letterheads, manifest sheets with annotations written in the margins in a man's careful hand, the handwriting of someone who understood that every mark he made would need to be read by someone who had not been there when it was made, and who had written accordingly. Precise, legible, organized. On top of the stack, separate from the documents, laid deliberately so it would be the first thing seen, a single folded sheet of white paper, a strip of tape pressed across the fold. On the tape, in the same careful hand, Mavis. Toby. The diner was completely silent. Mavis looked at her name and her son's name written in her husband's handwriting, the last 2 things Cliff Rowan had written down before the next morning. When he walked through the depot past Nettie Vale's window and did not come back, she peeled the tape back carefully. She unfolded the paper. She read it without making a sound. Her breathing changed, not dramatically a small deepening, a controlled expansion, the physical management of something large that was not going to come out in this room, in front of these people, until she had finished and done what the letter asked. Her hand, flat on the table, did not move. Toby was watching her face. He had seen that face in the railcar at 3 a.m. when she thought he was asleep, and he knew what it cost her to hold it still. When she finished, she folded the letter back along its original crease and pressed her palm flat against it. "He wrote it the night before he died," she said. Her voice had the quality of something that has been through the breaking point and come out the other side carrying a different kind of weight, not the weight of endurance, but the weight of what endurance had been for. He says the documents are organized to show the 9-month pattern. He says if anything happened to him, they go to the ICC Fraud Division federal level, not Sacramento. He specifically says, not Sacramento. He names Vern Haskell by his full name. He names 2 cargo routes. He names the account numbers where the skimmed freight value was being absorbed. She stopped. When she spoke again, her voice was at the precise edge of where the steadiness she was maintaining ended. He says he loves us. He says to make sure Toby takes care of the locomotive. Toby's hand went into his coat pocket and closed around it and did not come back out. He was 8 years old, and he had just heard his father's last words, read aloud in a diner, 4 months after the morning his father went to work and did not come home. He did not cry. He sat with his hand in his pocket around the small red train, and he was very still, and he understood everything in the room at a level most adults would underestimate. Cal Deming leaned over the documents. He read with the eyes of a man who had spent 30 years reading exactly this type of form, not skimming, not looking for highlights, but reading the way people read when they know what they are looking for and what finding it means. Nobody spoke. Ruth had locked the front door 10 minutes earlier without announcement, citing a gas burner issue to the one person who had tried to come in. She stood at the end of the counter with her arms crossed, not pretending to be doing anything else. Cal looked up. His expression had the flat certainty of someone who does not make statements he cannot support. Cliff knew what he was doing, Cal said. Incoming weight certificates, outgoing manifest totals, payment vouchers for the same 9-month period. The average gap between declared incoming weight and outgoing manifested weight is 11% across 37 shipments on 2 routes. 11% of that freight volume is real money. He set the last page down carefully. These are copies, but they match originals that are still sitting in the freight yard archive. If those originals haven't been touched, these documents verify directly against them. Has Haskell had time to destroy the originals? Steve said. Destroying archive records requires a formal 60-day hold request under the freight company charter, Cal said. He'd have to apply for authorization. Either he started that process, in which case we have weeks, not months, or he assumed the copies were gone and left the originals in place. He paused. But now that you've been seen talking to Nettie at the depot, and now that I'm here, if Haskell has anyone watching, he knows something has changed. He may move on the originals tonight. Then we have until morning, Steve said. He was already standing. Ruth. Telephone is in the back, Ruth said. Use it as long as you need. The kitchen smelled of coffee and soup stock and years of mornings. Steve picked up the black wall phone and gave the operator a San Francisco number from memory. A federal attorney named Mercer met at a racing event the previous spring. Commercial fraud cases out of the Western District. A man who had given Steve his card after a conversation that had started with engines and moved, the way certain minds move, toward the mechanics of how systems of fraud were built and why small junctions were particularly attractive to the people who built them. 4 rings. Mercer. Steve McQueen. Laguna Seca last spring. You gave me your card. A pause. I remember. I need the ICC Fraud Division's field contact for Central California today. He spoke for 6 minutes without embellishment or repetition. The freight pattern, the documents, Cliff's death, the fabricated debt, the sheriff who had closed the case in 4 days, the lawyer in Haskell's pocket, the man at the diner counter who had not turned a newspaper page in 15 minutes. When he finished, Mercer was quiet for a moment. ICC has a field investigator in Fresno, Garrett. Tell the widow to hold those documents and let no one unauthorized near them. I'll make a call in 30 minutes. Can Garrett be in Dellard today? If I make the right call, same day. A pause. Stay close to the widow. Steve hung up and went back into the diner. Haskell came back at 3:15. This time he did not come alone. Sheriff Burl Sutter filled the doorframe behind him, a large man carrying the particular discomfort of someone who has held a story together for months and can feel it developing fissures under the pressure of this room. Behind the sheriff, a half-step back and a half-step sideways, was Donald Price in a dark coat, briefcase held against his chest the way a man holds an object when he needs something to do with his hands and has run out of other options. 3 men, deliberately arranged, Haskell forward, law behind, legal instrument behind that, a structure assembled without appearing to be assembled. This was how Haskell operated, architecture disguised as a rival. His eyes went to the table the moment he cleared the doorframe, to the leather case, to the documents that Cal Deming had carefully restacked on the table beside it. His gaze touched them for no longer than it touched the salt shaker or the window or any other object in the room. But it touched them. Something shifted in his face at the very edges, not his expression, which did not change, but the particular quality of a man recalibrating, walking into a room that is further along than he had arranged for. Mrs. Rowan. His voice was exactly what it had been at noon. This was the most unsettling thing about Vern Haskell. He had no other register. Not here, not now, not with documents on the table and a federal investigator already driving. I wanted to make sure you'd had time to consider the February situation. Mrs. Rowan's situation has changed, Steve said. Haskell looked at him with the polite, mild attention he offered to things he was in the process of evaluating. This afternoon, Steve said, I spoke with a federal attorney in San Francisco who has contacts with the ICC Fraud Division. There is an investigator driving from Fresno to Dellard at this moment. The room went quiet. Burl Sutter had been studying the floor for 30 seconds, the arithmetic of what he had done and what it now cost, and the numbers not resolving in his favor. Haskell's composure did not collapse. Men like Haskell did not collapse. But at the edges of him, in the area around the eyes where control was hardest to maintain for longest, something had gone very still in the way things go, still when they are identifying an exit they were not expecting to need. I'm not sure what you believe you've found, Haskell said. I would caution. Steve stood up. He walked to the table and picked up a single document from Cliff Rowan's stack, the September shipment, Route 12W, the largest single discrepancy, annotated in Cliff's hand. Incoming weight, outgoing weight, and the arithmetic of what vanished between them, written in the margin by a man who knew he might not be there to explain it. He held it where Haskell could see it. He did not say anything about the route number or the account number. He let Haskell look at it. Haskell looked at it. His eyes moved across the page with the attention of a man who is intimately familiar with this type of document and is determining exactly how much of what he is looking at has been understood by the people holding it. He said nothing. Steve set the document back on the stack. Cliff Rowan wrote your name down, Steve said. Before he went to the yard. He put it in a sealed letter, and he locked it in that case, and he gave his wife the key. She's been wearing it around her neck since the night you had him killed. Every hour, every day, for 4 months. He let that sit for a moment. You moved fast after November. House, debt, sheriff, lawyer. You closed every door. You did good work. He picked up his coffee cup. You missed the case. Come. The room was absolutely still. Haskell's composure did not break, but at the edges of it, something had gone very still, the look of a man identifying an exit he was not expecting to need. I'll be consulting my attorney, he said. He's standing right behind you, Steve said. I'd start now. Donald Price had moved 2 steps back during this exchange and was now definitively closer to the door than to the table. He was holding his briefcase against his chest with both hands. His face had the expression of a man reviewing a decision he made 6 years ago and understanding, for the first time, its full consequence. Burl Sutter raised his eyes from the floor. He looked at Cal Deming. Cal looked back. Between them, a retired brakeman and an aging sheriff, 2 men looking at the specific distance between who they had been this morning and who this moment required them to become. Cal, Sutter said. Burl, Cal said. The county filing on the Rowan death, Cal said, carefully, like a man measuring the weight of each word. Given what's in those documents, it's going to need to be revisited. Sutter looked at his hat, then at Mavis, then at Toby, who was watching him from the end of the table with the patient, assessing eyes of a boy who had been watching adults navigate their failures for months and had long since stopped expecting anything good to come of it, who was watching now to see if this time was different. Sutter put his hat back on. "I'm going to need to make some calls," he said. "Make them," Steve said. Sutter walked toward the door without looking at Haskell. Haskell did not look at Sutter. Between them, the particular quality of two men who have been useful to each other and have just become liabilities, and both know it. Haskell walked out. Price followed. The door swung shut. Ruth Ainsley came out from behind the counter and locked it. Nobody asked her to. Nobody had to. Nettie Vale came to the diner at 4 o'clock. Ruth had called her 20 minutes earlier. The call was 3 sentences. Nettie had hung up, put on her good coat, and come through the side door with the deliberate forward momentum of a person who has made a decision after a very long time of not making one, and who is moving before the courage runs out. She sat down directly across from Mavis. She did not look at Steve first or at Cal Deming. She looked at Mavis the way a person looks at someone they have been wronging by omission for months, a look that carries the specific weight of a debt that has been accumulating interest and has become more familiar, more lived in, than the idea of paying it. "I was on duty the night your husband died," Nettie said. She said it the way a person says something they have been saying inside their own head every night for 4 months, said past the point of rehearsal, into the flatness of something that is simply true and has been true the entire time and cannot be made untrue by waiting. He came through the depot at 6:40 in the evening. He had his work bag. He said good evening to me on his way through. She paused. He always said, "Good evening." He was the only person from that yard in 31 years who said good evening every single time he came through that door. Every time. Never forgot. Mavis was very still. Her hands were pressed flat on the table in front of her. The leather case was beside Toby. The key was inside her coat. The room around her was absolutely quiet. He was not alone, Nettie said. A beat. 2 men came through the depot behind him. I did not know them. They were not yard workers, wrong clothes, no badges. The look of men who have driven from somewhere rather than finished a shift. They were following him at a distance that was, she stopped. Found the word. Deliberate. The way you follow when you need the person ahead of you not to know they are being followed. Her hands were shaking visibly. She did not try to stop them. I told the sheriff Cliff came through alone, she said. She let that sit. I told him that because 2 days after the accident, Mr. Haskell came and sat at my counter. He talked about how terrible it was, about the freight company's position, about the people in this town who depended on the freight contracts, about how an investigation would be damaging and uncertain, and how the harm might spread to people who had nothing to do with anything. She stopped. He said all of it quietly, reasonably, the way he says everything, as though he were simply making sure I had information I might not have considered, as though none of it was anything other than concern. A pause that held everything that had happened to Mavis and Toby since November. My nephew works the freight platform at this junction, Nettie said. 3 children. Mr. Haskell has mentioned them by name to me more than once over the years. He mentions things like that. He is careful that way. She looked up from her hands. First at Steve, then at Mavis. I chose what I chose because I was frightened, and because I told myself that what I had seen was not enough, that it wouldn't change anything, that it would only bring harm to my family without helping yours. Her voice had gone past the controlled and into something truer and more painful. I have known that was wrong every day since November. I have been living inside that choice for 4 months. I cannot do it anymore. I cannot carry it one more day. She reached into her coat pocket and placed a small notebook on the table. Worn cover. She opened it to a page near the back. Small, neat handwriting. Several lines. I wrote down what I saw the night it happened, she said. While it was exact, I did not know what else to do with it. The descriptions of the 2 men. Their clothing. The time they followed Cliff through to the platform side. The time the foreman called emergency services. She pushed the notebook across the table to Steve. I have not changed one word. Steve read the page, read it again, handed it to Cal without speaking. Cal read it. When he looked up, something in his face had changed. One of these descriptions, Cal said, with the precision of a man who has known this name and kept it to himself for months, matches a man named Cord. He does contract work out of the Sacramento office. I have seen him at this yard twice. He comes when Haskell needs something handled that he does not want a local name attached to. Steve looked at Nettie. "Will you write a formal statement?" "That is why I am here," she said. Not bravely, not dramatically. Simply as a fact about why she had come through the door. Mavis looked at Nettie Vale across the table. The look between them was not warm. It was honest. It was the look between two people who have been on opposite sides of the same weight, one of whom has been carrying it alone in the cold, and between whom warmth, if it came, would have to be earned over time. "Thank you," Mavis said. "It cost you something to come here." Nettie looked at her hands. At the shaking she had stopped trying to manage. "Not nearly as much," she said quietly, "as it cost your family for me to stay away." At the end of the table, Toby had taken the red locomotive from his pocket. He held it in both hands, not playing with it, not putting it down, just holding it. Looking at it with the expression of someone holding something that contains more weight than its size suggests, and knowing it, and being unwilling to set it down. He had heard every word. He would carry every word. Garrett arrived at 6:45 in a dark sedan with valley dust on the hood and the alertness of a man who has been driving fast with a purpose and arrived with both intact. He was compact, 40 or so, with the particular quality of unhurriedness that belongs to people who walk into charged rooms for a living and have learned that charging a room further is never the right move. He shook hands with Steve, then Cal, then Ruth. He turned to Mavis and shook her hand while looking at her directly, not at the documents, not at the case, at her, which was its own kind of statement. Then he turned to Toby and extended his hand formally, as to an equal. Toby straightened when he took it. He had not been treated as a person by anyone in authority since November. The simple formality of being acknowledged a handshake, eye contact, the implication that he was in the room registered in his face. Garrett sat at the table, put on his reading glasses, and went through Cliff Rowan's documents for 40 minutes. Nobody spoke. Ruth set coffee in front of Garrett and stayed behind the counter. Nettie sat at the far end of the table with her hands in her lap, hat still on. Cal had his arms folded, eyes on the table. Mavis sat with her hands flat on the surface, watching Garrett read her husband's handwriting, page after careful page, the record of a man who had known something was wrong and refused to look away from it, and who had paid for that refusal, and whose refusal was now, finally, in the right room. Toby was asleep again across two chairs Ruth had pushed together, covered with a clean blanket, one hand in his pocket on the locomotive. His face, in sleep, was the face of a boy sleeping warm for the first time in 4 months. It was almost difficult to look at directly. Garrett took off his glasses. "Your husband was a thorough man," he said to Mavis. "He was," she said. "He was also right." Garrett set his glasses down with the deliberateness of someone who wants the room's full attention before the next sentence. What he documented is consistent with a pattern the ICC has been tracking across several California freight junctions for 18 months. Dellard Junction was on our list. We had not been able to place a source with inside access to the manifest records. What Mr. Rowan compiled provides the inside accounting we could not reconstruct from outside. He paused. These documents, combined with Mrs. Vale's formal statement and Mr. Deming's testimony regarding the manifest patterns, are sufficient grounds to open a full federal investigation into the freight operations at this junction, into Vern Haskell's contracting arrangements, and into the circumstances of Cliff Rowan's death. Mavis did not move for a moment. The room did not move. The debt instruments used to remove your family from your home appear to be instruments of coercion connected to an active federal fraud. If that holds, and the evidence suggests it will, they are legally void. There is federal housing assistance for families displaced under these circumstances. It involves paperwork and time, but it exists. You qualify. A pause. The characterization of your husband's death as accidental is going to require formal reopening in light of Mrs. Vale's statement. I cannot tell you the outcome. I can tell you the review will happen, and it will not be closed in 4 days. Mavis was very still. Then, very briefly, she pressed her lips together, the specific, private gesture of someone who has been holding something at great cost for a long time and is only now beginning to understand that the holding is no longer entirely her job alone. She did not cry. She had told Steve earlier in the day that she had run out of tears sometime in October, and that what had replaced them was not emptiness but something harder and more permanent. What was in her face now was not relief. It was the particular quality of a door opening that a person had stopped believing would open. "Cliff thought things deserved to be on the record," she said. Her voice was quiet and exact. He thought the truth being stated officially, in a form that couldn't be erased, mattered. That the world knowing what was real meant something. It does matter, Garrett said. What he documented is going to matter considerably. Steve was at the window. Outside, the depot sign angled on its broken mount, catching the street lamp. The rail spur was dark. The chimney pipe on the second car from the end was cold tonight. Nobody was sleeping in it. Cal gave his statement in 2 handwritten pages before leaving. At the door, he stood in front of Mavis for a moment. "I should have done this sooner," he said. "Yes," Mavis said, "but you did it now. That counts." Nettie wrote her formal statement at the counter in her small, precise hand, Ruth standing nearby and not leaving. When Nettie finished, she capped the pen, looked at what she had written, and folded her hands on top of it. "I have been carrying that for 4 months," she said. "I know," Ruth said. She brought a piece of pie without asking. Garrett made calls from the back telephone. By the time he left for the county seat, the freight yard's documents were under federal hold, and Vern Haskell had a call waiting from a federal attorney that he had not yet returned. He would return it in the morning. The morning would not go well for him. After Garrett left, the diner was quiet in a different register, not the quiet of people managing something frightening, but the quiet of people on the other side of something, not safe, not finished. But through the worst of it, standing in the part of the dark where the light was visible, Ruth sat down beside Mavis without ceremony, not saying anything particular, being there, which was the thing that presence becomes when words have been used up. Steve looked at Mavis from across the room. "You carried that case," he said. 4 months, alone, in that car, through every attempt to remove you and erase what Cliff found. Nobody helped you do that." She looked at him. "You came," she said. "At the end of one day," he said. "The 4 months were you." She held his look for a moment. Then she nodded, not agreement exactly. Recognition. The kind that happens when someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time is finally told, plainly, that they did not fail at it. The morning came the way January mornings come in the valley darkness, softening first above the eastern ridgeline, then gray, then a pale gold that moved across the flatland slowly, as if it had traveled far to get here and was in no particular hurry now that it had arrived. Ruth had given Mavis and Toby the back storeroom the night before, a cot, a space heater, a door with a lock. She had opened it without framing it as anything other than what it was. "This is yours until you have somewhere proper." She had not looked at Mavis when she said it. That was how Ruth showed the things she did not know how to show while being looked at. Toby had walked into the room, looked at the cot and the heater and the locked door, and sat down on the cot without taking off his coat. He had looked at the floor for a moment. Then he lay back with his hand in his pocket and was asleep in under 2 minutes. He did not move for 8 hours. He slept the way children sleep when they are finally, for the first time in a long time, somewhere that feels like they are allowed to stay. Steve had slept in the truck. He had done it before. He had spent years in conditions that didn't offer better, and he had developed the specific capacity of sleeping adequately in small and uncomfortable spaces that men acquire when comfort has been a variable rather than a given. He was on the depot platform at 6:15 with a thermos of coffee, watching the light come up above the track line to the east. The rails caught the early gold and held it 2 long lines running from where he stood toward the horizon and past it. The particular quality of train tracks in the early morning, the suggestion of distance and direction and everything that exists on both sides of a present moment. He heard the step behind him at 6:40. Light, deliberate, the step of someone who had spent months learning to move quietly through spaces where quiet was a form of safety, and who had not yet unlearned it in a room that no longer required it. Toby came and stood beside him, coat buttoned, hat on. The red locomotive held out in front of him in both palms, not in his pocket but in his hands, held the way children hold things they have taken out for a purpose and want to see properly. They stood side by side in the early gold and looked down the track line without speaking. "My dad used to stand here," Toby said. Steve said nothing. In the morning before his shift, he said the tracks looked longer in the early light than any other time. Toby looked down the rails. He said they looked like they went all the way to the places you had been and all the way to the places you were going to be, both at the same time. Steve looked down the track. The light on the rails had deepened from pale gold to the richer gold of a morning establishing itself, and what Cliff Rowan had described was exactly what was there, the sense of both direction and history in a single line of steel. the past and the future running together toward the same horizon. He was right, Steve said. Toby turned the locomotive over in both hands. The red paint was worn through at every edge and corner, down to the silver gray of the base metal, a year of being held every day, put in a pocket, taken out, held again. Every time the weight of something needed somewhere to go, every time the dark got quiet and the cold got deep and a boy needed something solid in his hand that reminded him of someone. He gave it to me on my birthday, Toby said. Last year. He said it simply, the way children name the most important things, without drama, without decoration, as a simple fact about the world that should be known. Did you ever ride on a train? He asked. A few times, Steve said. Not enough. Toby nodded, filing this. I'm going to work on trains when I grow up, he said, like my dad. The first time, in the hearing of anyone who had been near him in 4 months, the first time Toby Rowan had placed himself in the future, the first time he had said, when I grow up. Steve heard it for what it was, a boy who had spent 4 months living entirely in the present tense of survival, who was, this morning, for the first time, allowing himself a future to walk toward. That's a good plan, Steve said. Toby looked at him with his serious, level eyes. I know, he said. Mavis came out of the side door of the diner a few minutes later. Her hair was down loose, the color of dark wood in the early light, the first time it had been down since Steve had known her. The difference from the tightly controlled version she had worn every day in the railcar was enough that she looked, for a moment, like the person she had been before November, gave her a different job to do. She walked to the platform and stopped a few feet behind them, looked at her son and this man standing beside him, both looking down the track in the early gold, and something in her face went very still, in a way that was different from all the other stillnesses she had maintained through the previous day. Not the stillness of managing, the stillness of being, very quietly, present for something. Garrett called this morning, she said. The housing assistance applies immediately in documented displacement cases. There are forms. Weeks, not months. She paused. He also said the federal review of Cliff's case is formally open as of today. She looked at the rails rather than at Steve. He said it won't bring him back. No, Steve said. He said it will put the truth on the record. She was quiet for a moment. Cliff believed that mattered, that the world, knowing what was real officially, permanently, that it meant something. He was the kind of man who thought the record was worth dying for. Her voice was steady and exact, and held at some cost. I used to think that was simply who he was. Now, I think he was right. Steve looked at her. He was right, he said. She stood with them while the morning finished arriving. The town behind them woke slowly, a door somewhere, a truck starting, a voice from an upstairs window rising and falling and gone. Eventually, Steve went to his truck. He set the thermos behind the seat, checked that he had everything he had arrived with, which was not much. He traveled light. He had arrived with what fit in a jacket and the cab of a pickup truck, and that was what he was leaving with. He came back to the platform. He stopped in front of Toby and crouched down to eye level. The actor and the 8-year-old boy on a California depot platform in the January morning, the early light on both their faces. You take care of that locomotive, Steve said. Toby looked at him with the level, serious eyes that had been his for 4 months and would be his for the rest of his life. I always do, he said. Steve stood and faced Mavis. She extended her hand. He took it. Her grip was the grip of someone who does not offer what they are not fully prepared to give, who had given nothing carelessly for a very long time. Thank you, she said. You carried the case. He said. 4 months. Alone. In the cold. With a child and no help and no floor and no certainty that it would ever matter. That was the whole thing. Everything else was just one day. She looked at him for a moment. It was the only thing I had left of what he did, she said. I wasn't going to let them take that too. She said it without defiance, as a simple fact about herself that she had not expected to say aloud, and that, once said, was exactly true. Steve walked to the truck, started the engine, the '59 Chevy caught with the solid growl of something maintained by someone who cared, and pulled out of the depot lot and onto the main street heading south. He drove past Ainsley's Diner, where the open sign was going on in the window, and Ruth Ainsley was already moving between tables inside. Past the hardware store, past the barber shop, past the county bank with its conspicuously clean windows. He did not stop. At the edge of town, Route 33 opened up and ran south between winter fields, brown now, green again in March, with the valley wide on both sides and the sky larger than everything under it. He rolled down the window, cold January air, clean off the valley floor, and he drove with one arm on the door in the unhurried way of a man who has no particular appointment, no particular schedule, no direction other than south, through a California morning in January 1962, because the road goes that way, and a road going somewhere is always worth following. He did not look in the mirror. He had learned, in a life that had required a great many things of him, that looking back at what you had done was mostly a way of slowing down. The work was done. The record was open. The morning had happened and could not be taken back. A mile south of Dellard Junction, the town was gone behind him, and the road ahead was long and clear, and lit by the kind of winter morning that makes you understand why people come to California and don't leave. Steve McQueen settled into the seat and let the engine run. Behind him, on a depot platform in a small town in the San Joaquin Valley, a woman stood in the early light with her hair loose for the first time in months, watching a truck disappear into the distance until there was nothing left of it but the road. She did not move for a long time. When she finally looked away from the road, she looked at her son, and beside her a boy holding a red locomotive in both palms, worn to the base metal at every edge, carried every hour of the hardest 4 months of his life, looked down a set of tracks running all the way to the horizon. He knew what his father had said about those tracks, that they looked like they went to all the places you had been and all the places you were going to be at the same time. He knew now that his father was right. He was 8 years old. He had a locomotive in his hands and a future in front of him, and a father's name that was going on the record, permanently, where it could not be erased. He held the locomotive. He looked at the horizon, and for the first time since November, he was not afraid of what came next. Some mornings are like that. They arrive without announcement. You only understand later that everything changed in them.